everybody. Welcome to episode 2 of Databased. Today is a super fun topic, one I know a little bit about, but not a lot about. And so I've got Jamie and James here to help answer all my questions. The topic being single page applications, the SPAs, the SPAs of the world.
So hot right now. So hot again right now.
They're so hot, and they have been since 2004. And I think that's kind of part of what I want to talk about. These SPAs, single page applications, these have kind of been around in one form or another for a long time. I would argue, the first major one at scale was probably Gmail in 2004 and Google Maps. I'm sure people were hacking on Ajax applications prior to that a little bit. But just to prime anybody who's not entirely clear on what a single page application is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that it effectively is a single HTML file that gets downloaded to your browser, and that's it. The rest of the interactions and the rendering and changes on the screen all happen through JavaScript and DOM manipulation. Is that how you guys understand it as well?
Depending on when you're listening to this podcast, if you're listening to it right now and you've been on Twitter right now, as of June, 2024, this is a big hot topic / debate because officially single page apps were dead and now they're not dead. So this is a hotly debated topic, and hey, I'm glad we get to talk about it. But just, to situate single-page applications in the space of web development, there's multi-page applications and single-page applications. And a multi-page application is what you might imagine an old-school website is. Lots of different, completely separate HTML pages. When you click a navigation action, it loads a new page. And it's a separate, unrelated page. Single-page application, one HTML bundle with JavaScript, and when you click navigation buttons, it's the same page. It just changes what you see in the DOM. That's the very, very crude description of these two.
It changes my address bar too, but it's still the same file, just being manipulated.
It does these days. Probably for the first 10 years of dynamic HTML, HTTP request backed applications, Ajax applications actually didn't change your address bar, so history was kind of broken. But these days, there's good APIs for allowing your URL bar to your location to actually be changed. So probably for some listeners, it sounds strange. The distinction feels subtle or something like that, but there was a version of the web before JavaScript existed in browsers. And if you just, for a second as an engineer, stop and think for a little while, you're like, well, if the page can't run any code after it loads, the only way to change the page is to go back to the server and have it run code. And so that's the way everything worked before JavaScript, because you load a page and that's it. It was done. And so if you wanted anything to change about that page, you needed to round trip to the server again and get something different.
If you clicked on a button back in the day, it would be like a post request to the server. It would have to pass all the context it needed to be able to render the next page. Is this the CGI bin I recall so fondly trying to hack?
CGI bin came a little bit later even, but yes, I think we should define what CGI bin is. That was, the first time you could run programs, at least in a standardized way, when you clicked an action on a website, was there was a folder. If you're using, say, Apache back in the old days, there was literally a folder called CGI-bin, BIN, and I think CGI stood for Common Gateway Interface.
Yes, it did.
So,
and that meant run this C program, probably at the time, run the C program, or maybe it was some Perl. Later on, it was Python. But run this little program whenever this website gets hit, I guess. And that's how you made more sophisticated actions happen on the back end.
It's so powerful now. It's almost a blast from the past to remember this stuff, right? But but before CGI bin, right, all you had was ever static pages you happened to put in inside the directory that was the HTML root of your website. And CGI bin was a big advancement, because it's instead of just serving a static sort of pre-authored page, it would invoke a program, as James said, often a C program or maybe a Perl script or something like that. And that thing literally just printed the standard out. That's what it did. And so, in fact, I remember the first tech job I ever had, I had done some static websites, but I had not yet actually done a dynamic website. And I was working with these two people who were these kind of older Perl hackers. And they told me, I still remember the lesson because it was so mind blowing. They're like, the first two things you have to do are like print a standard out, content type, text HTML, new line, and then you need to do one extra new line, and then you could start doing your HTML. And at the time, I had no idea what was going on. I'm like, why do I have to put this weird stuff at the top of the page? And I didn't learn until later. Oh, the way CGI worked is it would pass control off to you when it was still in the headers, and that way you could add your own headers, but it was up to you to like add an extra new line, which inside of HTTP is what ends the headers, and then you can feature the content. So it's very low level stuff, but the fact that you could have a program participate in making a web page at all was pretty cool back in 1997, 98, or when this stuff was first starting to happen.
Yeah, that is so gnarly. Thinking about the types of conversations that we're having today, just the layers of abstractions beyond that is kind of hard to wrap your head around. Like right now, we're having debates about re-architecting your app to save 10 milliseconds off of some time. Like it's I guess we've come a long way. And then it was 95. JavaScript was released by Brendan Eich. I can't pronounce his name. He was at Netscape. I recall JavaScript 1 very fondly. I think that was about when I discovered the real magic of development. That was I think the first programming I really ever came across. And you could I created a website where you could write your name, and then with JavaScript 1, it would save that and it would put it at the top of the website on GeoCities. And and I think it was like a Simpsons fan page.
My first website was a Simpsons fan page. Back in 96, I think, 96, 97, I had a somewhat popular Simpsons website.
How did you know it was popular?
Oh, because people would email. Because you'd have like a mail to Cowling, and then,
Oh, I was definitely expecting you to say you have the hit counter.
Counter.
Oh, I probably had a hit counter. Yeah.
Talking about CGI scripts. Yeah.
Exactly. 1,200 visits. You kidding me? We were probably in the same WebRing.
I was also in the Simpsons WebRing. Should we define what a WebRing is, just as a little aside?
Oh, we gotta bring it's gonna come back in some shape or form. Jane, yeah. What's a WebRing?
Okay, so before Google existed, before search engines even existed, back Yahoo may have existed, but it was just a directory. You might say, how would you even find a website? How would you know a website even existed? And the way that oftentimes people found the website existed was that you would join a web ring. And a web ring was literally a circle of websites on a similar topic. So you get on the Simpsons web ring, and so you'd have a little banner at the bottom of your page that said, this is James's Simpsons website. But if you click the button on the right, it's going to take you to Tom's Simpsons website.
Yeah.
You click that and you're going to go to discover Tom's website. And I'm sure you had a little button saying click right. You'll find Jamie's Simpsons website. And I guess maybe if you kept clicking right, you'd make it back around to mine. But that's how discoverability kind of happened back then.
It was basically a linked list, right? Yeah. I mean,
exactly.
Because Yahoo was like a directory. Like if you weren't important enough to get listed, or they somehow didn't know about you, if you wanted some way to surface more proactively, like some community, like guerrilla type website presences, you could use these rings, and it was basically like a linked list of things. So you could find one that's relatively popular, maybe that's in the directory, but then chase the link around and traverse all the other interesting Simpsons stuff that all participated in this big linked list together. So pretty crazy. Yeah. Thinking back to this stuff, and half of this stuff I haven't thought about in a long time.
Yeah, definitely.
And maybe what's interesting about web rings, for example, and you just mentioned JavaScript, Tom, it's interesting to think back to how primitive the web was back at a time where a lot of these concepts originated, right? The initial web was just entirely static, and URLs, links going to places. And then you started having CGI bins, so you could click a link and some action would happen on the server. But at this point, the website wasn't really part of the application. The website was like the dumb terminal that talked to the application, right? So you had it's like the website was the keyboard and it was the monitor, but there was no logic happening on the website, right? It was all the logic was on the server, and you got sent a static page. It got, your even when PHP came around, you get rendered a static page in HTML. You see it, and there's a few little things you can do that would submit either a form action or a URL to the server. And then JavaScript got popular, and all of a sudden, the website was an application. All of a sudden, logic and program code was running on the browser. And that's just like a huge change in what a website even means, right? No longer is it just the view layer. It's part of the application, right? And a single page application is an extension, is like just the souped up version of that, right? You're running like a serious application locally on the client. And so this is a really big distinction between, say, these statically rendered multi-page apps and a single page app that was empowered by stuff like JavaScript, where there's real logic happening. There's a real almost like program running, well, there is a program running locally in your browser.
So JavaScript was the first non-HTML language to ever run in a browser. Prior to that, it was just a renderer for HTML, like full stop.
Yep. And even when JavaScript showed up, because there was this era kind of early in my web development career, right, between JavaScript existing, I think you said it around 95 or whatever, and then 2003 or whatever it was that Microsoft did the first XML HTTP request, which, just to give them credit, I think was actually to power Outlook email, if I'm remembering correctly. But like, that was one when Internet Explorer was starting to take power, and they just wedged that in there because they needed it. And then it ended up enriching the world. But between 95 and whatever day that was, 2002, 2003, although JavaScript existed, it could only really interact with client-side state, right? So because if anything that had to do with the server, I mean, it could maybe then kind of create animations, or it could create maybe richer controls that responded to logic. But then when you actually wanted to get that data to the server or get new data from the server, you still had to like reload the page and like maybe post a form or something. And so even though JavaScript was in there, it really was pretty like limited, because it could only really work with local state that was in the application for a long time. There really was no way to trigger communication with the server from that JavaScript environment for many years there, actually, until the popularization of XML HTTP request in the early 2000s,
which became AJAX.
Yeah, that's right. And then so it was all still multi-page application. JavaScript was great for anything you could do on the client locally, but had no direct contact with the server because there was no XML HTTP request or AJAX. And then I remember that era when jQuery came out. And if I'm remembering correctly, a big part of the jQuery value prop was the fact that it abstracted away differences in browsers, because it was a bit of the Wild West. Microsoft still had a chokehold on the browsers with IE, and they supported like different AJAX, and there's just a wide spread of different APIs and functionality. And then jQuery came in and democratized that type of development and made it possible to like truly build once and have it run across basically every major browser.
Yeah, jQuery made things convenient. So we've gone through this lineage of like the website's just static to now you can, then there's the server can run actions. And then now you have a website that can run JavaScript. And initially that JavaScript oftentimes was just doing visual things on the page.
Mm-hmm.
And then Microsoft comes along with XML HTTP request, which became AJAX, right? Which was asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And the whole point of that was that JavaScript, you're looking at a page, that JavaScript can then go talk to a server, fetch some data, and then render it in that page without like reloading the page, making a navigation action. This was like a huge innovation. Now, the ability for the client to talk to the server and then get some information back and use that in rendering the page dynamically in response to actions you take. But it was hard to use. And every browser did things slightly differently. And it was awkward. Yeah.
I was going to say, an unfortunately large part of my professional web development career was in the era where You still IE4, IE5, IE55, IE6, and the last sort of gasps of Netscape were still around, and Phoenix Firefox was just rising. And so there was a certain point where Opera was around in an early phase, although it didn't have much market share. And the standards were all over the place. So nobody agreed on exactly what the right semantics were for all these APIs. Even each version of IE had dramatically different behavior with these things. It was a nightmare to program against, and there was a lot of branching based on what user agent you happen to be in and stuff like that. jQuery was a breath of fresh air because it abstracted away that stuff from you and gave you these it didn't really add any fundamental capabilities to the browser, but it made it much more accessible to leverage the power of the browser by providing nicer APIs and a consistent API that hid all the idiosyncrasies of each individual browser from you and took care of that for you. It changed things overnight for web developers, and probably getting the years wrong, but around 2005, 2006, whenever it really started to come out, it was just sea change.
Now, are we giving jQuery credit for popularizing the idea of a framework? Is this like the first seriously popular framework for building dynamic web applications?
It probably was. Yeah, I mean, there were things around the same era like MooTools and they were a little later, some a little earlier, but I think
significant PHP applications too, right? Like vBulletin was around 2000, 2001, 2002. Now, it wasn't dynamic, but it was a robust framework that was operating at scale.
Sure. Are you referring to app browser side things though, James?
Yeah, browser side. Because as we lead into stuff like React, right? I mean, most web devs these days, they're like framework developers. Like they work on a framework. It's kind of rare these days to be writing just regular old HTML and JavaScript and not a framework somehow.
Yeah, you'd have to be off your rocker.
Yeah, I think there's something to give jQuery a ton of credit for a second. Is that I'll include myself in this because again, I was a bona fide card-carrying web developer at the time. A lot of us, although we used JavaScript, we looked at it with a fair amount of disdain because it felt like a toy, because it was such a nightmare. The browser vendors didn't seem to take the standards seriously, and it was always a pain in the ass. And I think that jQuery represented having the vision actually to say, hey, if we actually make this ergonomic to use, that's going to cause an explosion in the potential of what people can do in the web browser. And I think it ended up being very true, actually. Like it just, the funny thing is just removing all that friction, even though it didn't fundamentally make the browsers more capable, but it made it so much more accessible to build like more sophisticated things in the browser that it really raised the ceiling on how far we were going to go on the sophistication of applications in the browser.
Yeah. I feel like to your earlier question, James, jQuery felt like an inflection point for sure, just what it allowed so many developers to do, but more of like a library. I do remember working with jQuery on like an application at scale felt not right. It felt like it was maybe like a little bit brittle, just the way that it was sort of injected all over the place and did everything all the time. And I think what was inevitable out of that, because it became so popular and because this became such an obviously incredible way to write web applications, were the actual frameworks that followed that really tried to take web development to the next level of sophistication. So I'm thinking about Backbone and Angular and Ember, and they all started to introduce more formal software architecture patterns. I think they were all based on MVC, but they also all introduced the reactive components that people were really starting to get used to and enjoy. And like that was the Web 2.0 era where everything felt fast. And I agree. I think we have jQuery to thank. And I'm curious to what extent jQuery then went to inform the standards of browsers and then the frameworks in the future. But there was definitely an era there where those big JS frameworks came out and they were really powerful. I found them a little complex, a little complicated to use, but maybe that's just me.
Yeah, I mean, I personally didn't like jQuery back then, but I was I was a big nerd and kind of out of touch, and I like doing things manually, and I didn't like the people with jQuery programmers, and as a result, they may not know how to write things without jQuery. It was like, you kind of got used to the jQuery syntax, but what it did is, people don't think that much about browser compatibility anymore. But then, when future frameworks showed up, the ones you mentioned, right, and particularly like React years later, they really create a whole new way of interaction. So I felt like, to me, at least my experience at jQuery at the time was about making existing patterns a lot more convenient to use. Whereas later frameworks really changed the model for how you think about what a website even is. Right. And it became far more functional. It became almost like a functional programming thing where you had like data linked to components. And that, I think, is like a real hallmark of modern website design. It's quite an interesting concept that we just take for granted, but it didn't exist back in those days.
Yeah, I think that jQuery made APIs accessible, but it wasn't opinionated about architecture, actually, right? And so you still kind of wrote programs the same way. You just could write them much faster and with fewer headaches. And so I think the thing it did is, just going back to the mentality of taking the browser more seriously, is it suddenly caused framework thinking kind of people to lean a lot more into what was possible here, right? So jQuery is very inspiring. It was like, wow, you maybe could actually turn this into something. But I don't think it went far enough on having, opinionated patterns that really simplified your world, right? It made you very excited about what could be built, but you were still building things in a way that was not very sound. Data management problems and who updates who and all that kind of stuff. Like, you were still stitching it together quite manually. And that was a big problem, I think, in the kind of the heart of the jQuery era. And so, yeah, some of these frameworks you've mentioned, obviously, I think with React being the one that really, sort of crested the hill, that started to have more opinionation built into them about like where mutation happens and where rendering happens and stuff like that. That's really where you started to really achieve some of the efficiency in being able to confidently build larger applications. Instead of just being excited about it, you could start to actually do it successfully.
Right. Talking about opinions and React, I think you're spot on with that. React is known for having a very large, invested and engaged community, and that's a very good thing, in my opinion, for so many reasons. But it's also a framework that is under the control of specific companies and entities, right? So Meta owns React, and they ultimately will be making the decisions about changes that happen in React. I have to give them credit because they don't ignore the community. There will be controversial things that they add because it's opinionated, and sometimes very opinionated, that the community there will be some backlash. And then what we've seen really recently was this big change in React 19, where they were updating the way that suspense was going to work, which was different by default than previous versions of React. And there was a big outcry from the community, and the React core team took it to heart. They listened, and they actually put the release on hold until they found a better solution that was going to work for everybody. But where I want to bring this back to the SPA side of things. So at the very start of this conversation, we talked about there's SPA and then there's multi-page apps. I'm still trying to wrap my head around how a server side, like an SSR, like server side rendered page, would be different from a multi-page app. To me, it feels like when it's rendered on the server, every single time, every single view that you see is just an entirely new batch of HTML. How is that different from traditional, I suppose, multi-page applications?
I think the space of server-side rendering is big enough. It kind of depends on who you're asking, right? Because like some of the things we've seen pop up, like React server components and things like that, they're more opinionated takes on what we might mean by SSR. But I think the original maybe motivations behind moving some things back to taking SSR seriously again are, I mean, SEO and search engine indexing is a big deal. And one problem with single page apps, even though crawlers get more sophisticated about running JavaScript, but in general, if there's some initial load that has the content in it you want without running an interpreter, that's usually more beneficial for things like search indexing. And that matters a lot for especially commercial success. And then probably a second big thing is just like, these days with applications becoming bigger and bigger, it actually takes quite a while not only to send the application down to the browser, but even to have the JavaScript engine load the application and start running it. Right. And if you're reliant on some initial load DOM manipulation happening or something like that in order to give you a UI to begin to either read or react to, then it's a less satisfying user experience. You'd love to have something that the second the initial HTML is pulled down, there's at least some initial view. So I think that ostensibly, like, these are some relatively universal motivations that a lot of different teams, they need more of or they need less of. But like, it is nice, as much as we've gone into sophisticated single page applications, to acknowledge there are some trade-offs associated with them. And these are two of the bigger ones. I'll say something slightly spicy about the meta thing, right? Is it like React is great. It's awesome that they released it, right? It could only take, in some ways, a company like that, especially the time they did it, to really bootstrap this movement that's happened with all these other great frameworks coming out like Vue and Solid and Svelte and all these things that are really learned from React and in many respects are improvements on various elements of React. But in the long run, Meta is a very different company than every other company on earth. The things Meta needs, almost no one else actually needs, right? So as just an example, Meta is at the kind of scale where they could spend $15 million a year of labor in order to save 50 milliseconds on some page loads and potentially say that, there's a way that we feel that netted out to a $60 million benefit for us. And so therefore that is worth it to do. And so almost none of the rest of us are running organizations like that, where we don't, our incentives are not completely aligned with Meta, where Meta represents one of the 5 biggest, most sophisticated websites on earth with the kind of traffic it has. So,
and like, I think sorry, I want to touch on that specifically. The way that data fetching is handled and presented for a website or an app like Facebook really feels like very different from the needs of a typical application developer. Like a social network, the way that it works, the way that it needs to get its data versus basically anything else feels very different. And I'm wondering if, to your point, some of these changes are meta efficiency specific at the expense of the fact that the vast majority of React users and web developers just don't need that, or it's even worse, it's not optimal for them.
I love Jamie's point, right? I think this is almost the web dev community reaching a point of maturity that's really quite interesting, right? So if you're a systems engineer, you're like a distributed systems engineer, right? Or you should know that you should not build systems like Google, because you don't have a bajillion servers, right? You don't have 100,000 engineers or however many hundreds of thousands of engineers, right? You should build systems far more simply. You shouldn't use a distributed database if you don't need a distributed database, right? And so just because Google has all these amazing infrastructure engineers working there does not mean that's a good role model for how to design systems. They're horrendously overcomplicated for more folks, and I'll refrain from going on a rant about Kubernetes, etc. Similarly, you probably shouldn't build web apps like Facebook, right? And that seems controversial, right? Someone's going to hear that and be like, no, of course you should. They're the best or whatever. Mm-hmm. No, you shouldn't, right? Because your app does not look like their app, right? And your team does not look like their team, unless you're a similarly sized company, right? And then,
you're probably owned by Meta anyway, right?
Yeah.
Unless you're Instagram or WhatsApp.
And this is such an interesting point in time, like in the last couple of years, where React and Next and there's almost been like a fork in the road, right? Where a bunch of new interesting technologies have come along. I think the focus on server-side rendering is a big one, where web developers are starting to say, I don't know if I need this. I don't know if the trade-off of page load time versus complexity is worth it for me, and perhaps even is not even the right design pattern for my application.
Right, exactly. I totally agree, actually, and I'm proud, I think, of the web developer community in general. There is so much care and engagement and enthusiasm and passion, right? Like that's a good thing. And it was React 3 Fiber who was actually starting to talk about forking React to prevent the change that was otherwise upcoming in React 19, because their entire library relied on the way that it had worked prior. And React was the most compelling choice for single page applications. It felt like the poster child for how you would, it felt like by definition, that's what it was. And just to back up a sec, the impact of the change that they were going to make was going to affect the architecture of every single page application more or less and make them slower. So you'd have to fix that, you needed to do like a pretty significant rewrite, and you would stop co-locating your data fetching inside your component, which was what was preached for a long time and is very ergonomic and enjoyable and makes your code and components really modular. And you were going to have to remove that data fetching and put it earlier in the tree, like in your root loader and things like that. It was a change that was going to break what React was so good at for so many years for so many developers. And they were rightfully upset about that, to the point where they were talking about forking React. And we've all seen how that's gone one way or the other in the past. Yeah. I think a big part of what they're trying to solve is the complexities between maintaining stateful data, maintaining data that's up to date, and relying less on the components themselves or the developers to try to have to manage that. And I think Tanstack Query manages that really well. And it's the thing that drew me to Convex in the first place, where I think for people using Convex, the change probably wouldn't be that bad.
One complication of the scenario you're bringing up in general, right? Just to the yes, people talking about forks and all this, is that I think one thing it's important to say, just as much as this rich technical discourse around what's happening, right? Is it like, I don't think anyone's doing anything particularly nefarious here, right? You know what I mean? Like, you have to, but this is the kind of community interest in these things everyone has to always be mindful of, right? So if Facebook is the steward of React, if Meta is the steward of React, it's entirely natural that Meta is going to try to make React the best possible thing it needs, right? There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it is a very rare animal. Most other places, as James said, you're not Google, so don't go services crazy before you have to, or whatever. You are not Facebook. So the optimizations that were taking on the complexity at meta scale, it almost definitely is not worth taking on the complexity at your scale. It's those optimizations do not matter to you yet. Similarly, if you are, let's say, a platform vendor that what you sell is server-side compute, like edge server-side rendering, you are going to want more of the future to run on the server than on the client, because you don't get paid when code runs on the client, right? So, and I think all of these cases, it's pretty natural for the steward to want to move the technology in the direction that most benefits itself. I think it's just important to recognize that, to always examine how much is this consistent with the needs of 99.8% of websites out there that you're not meta scale, and you're not a platform reseller, that has a bunch of edge compute cool stuff that they want to make use out of. So for a lot of us, I think that's part of what the outrage is that, it was almost a pull away from single page apps, right? As single page apps are getting pretty good. Right. And so there's definitely need to tighten up a couple of things. We're on this oscillation, right? Like it swings back and forth, the pendulum. We went really heavy SPAs. There are some trade-offs. We should put some work in to gain back some of what we lost. But I don't think it's like, okay, that whole thing was a mistake. Now we're going to go back to PHP or whatever. Like we've all been talking about to each other about the last 25 years. We've worked in that world. Don't go back.
Yeah, it's pretty good. Like we have it good.
President's
But
great.
things are getting pretty good right about now. Let's just nudge back some of the stuff we lost and keep moving forward. That's definitely the right way.
And Tom, when you talk about server side components or server components, it can mean quite a few different things. And it can mean like full static site generation where you just, fully rendering, the server is talking to the database and fully rendering a page and sending you some static content, right? That is that's great for blogs and marketing websites and this and that, right? If you have a CMS, maybe that's great for you. And maybe that does a lot to improve page load times and and you get all the benefits of SEO, etc. If you have a more dynamic application, there is a model too that works just great, right? Which is like partial server rendering, where you maybe fully rendering the page, sending it down to the client, but it gets hydrated client side, and then the client goes and talks to the server and fetches any later state, and it becomes a dynamic application again.
Mm-hmm.
Fine model can be pretty complicated, so it's not wrong. It can be incorrect sometimes because it can be quite hard sometimes to have a consistent representation of server data on the client with this model.
Right.
But it's just a bit complicated, and it doesn't.
That's all the hydration. That's like when you you get the console errors. That's like, oh, you're like P element is out of place, and so it's mismatches what we have on the server, and everything's falling apart. And then you have to go figure out how to hydrate it identically to what you sent on the server.
He's like, Meta aren't stupid, right? Facebook.com is not written in a dumb way. It's not. It's just written in a way that you probably don't need to do early on. And so I think some of the say resentment with the push away from SPAs and the push towards server-side rendering is it's great for some folks, but it's probably not the right default for most people. And it's something people can choose to adopt later on in the life cycle of their application if they're finding that initial page load time is really important, or the bundle size is getting too large, or all these reasons. But it just doesn't necessarily feel like the right default. And I imagine folks who are talking about forking React, partly it's because they probably don't hate the new ideas. They probably don't think these new ideas are bad ideas because they're not bad ideas. They're just a level of sophistication and complexity that probably most application developers don't want to or don't need to deal with.
Yeah, I think it makes total sense.
One of the things that's been interesting to see in this version of the pendulum swinging this time around is it's like, the old ideas new again and stuff like that. So back in, we were just talking about this history of things evolving. In 2007, 2008, I was working as a web developer writing a Python based application. And because, React didn't exist yet, we were all trying to struggle with like, what's the right way to marshal state changes around stuff like that. And the way that it's actually, I think it might still be in production or somewhere. But in the way that I ended up making a web framework there, that what it did is it shipped HTML fragments around to just swap them in the DOM. And so it's very interesting to me to see among all the other things where people are just trying to wrestle with the complexities of the world we've ended up in, some of the trade-offs about SPAs, some of like, oh, the holy grail is if we just go back to this, it's going to be simpler. Like that, we tried that too. Like that, that has pros and cons as well.
It's just always something in the middle, right? Like there are trade-offs, and there's trade-offs with everything, and like this is no exception. There are good reasons to render things on the server and have it sent to you. There are also situations in which maybe that's not ideal. Maybe that actually increases latency to have round trips with that much data every time, as opposed to having the client itself interact with, say, your data center. Right. And so the idea of having your state directly reactive to the data that's in your database, I feel like makes a lot of sense. It could be a lot more reactive and even faster by negotiating that through the client, whereas maybe other components make sense to be on the server side. Like it always feels like it's the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. I mean, when you frame it that way, Tom, makes me think about like just desktop programming, right? Like if you write a sophisticated desktop application with multiple tabs and views and into your application, they're not separate programs, right? It's all just one application, right? It's one application and it talks to like some data store. It might be in memory, it might be on a database. And I think partly why people like SPAs is it's the same thing. It's just one application. So you download this JavaScript and it might cache some state. It might have some information locally that it manipulates as part of the DOM, but also partly local state that is synced from the server. It's a very convenient model. There's nothing inherently wrong with multi-page applications, and you can use like browser local storage to share state between them. It just so happens that building an application as a single application is quite a convenient development model, and it's especially conducive to dealing with state, dealing with data, because that state generally or very often spans multiple pages.
Also, is it something about the way people are starting to talk about this too? Just reminds me of like a refinement is less sexy than a revolution, and it doesn't retweet as well. So it's probably what we need here is a refinement, not really a revolution. And if it was a true revolution, it probably wouldn't just look like a repackaging of old ideas we already left behind, right? So this is probably in my opinion, part of the natural consequence of like when things have changed a lot, there's a little bit of a blowback. There's a little bit of a regrouping and saying, what have we given up here? And it's important to respect that and address it. But I don't really think that like we're going back, honestly.
Yeah. Thinking like taking this all the way back to first principles, if the goal, which I think is a good goal, is to have more developers creating more things in the world, for me, that speaks to developer ergonomics. It speaks to how easy we or the frameworks make it for developers to achieve what they're trying to achieve. First and foremost, I think the net benefit, I think there's a net positive to trading off micro optimizations of milliseconds for this or that. And on the flip side, having fewer developers being able to actually develop their products, or it's that much harder, it takes that much longer. I would personally love, if I ever am in a position to optimize for developers being able to get shit done. Above all, right? Obviously within reason. But I feel like the greater impact in the world is more people building stuff. And the easier we make that, so ergonomics and developer experience, the more likely we're going to see that result. Whereas I believe the pendulum shifts and swings, and to some degree, I feel like maybe those ergonomics, those came at the latency or the performance gains came at the cost of those ergonomics. And the net result would be we would see developers building fewer things.
Yeah, I mean, you see all these studies that, we made page load 10 milliseconds faster and people click the buttons more regularly or whatever. These unsurprisingly, advertising companies are big on these studies, right? Because they make money whenever you click stuff, right? What you don't see is the study that like this company didn't build enough stuff because it took too long to build stuff, right? It's far more important, right? Like how fast your thing loads is a lot less important than whether your thing exists or not.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And when your thing exists and it works and you built it fast and you got to add the new features, these are the important things. And yes, you can go A/B test and optimize later on, right? But the number one thing, number 1 through 99 is, are you building cool shit and are you getting it out the door?
It's like premature optimization, right? All over again. What's old is new.
Exactly. I agree. Yeah. So it's like, let's keep doing that stuff for sure. I mean, I think that the point in another episode where we talked about like true progress, I think James put it this way, is sort of like things get better, but the complexity isn't bubbled up. So yeah, if we want, we have these great ergonomic benefits we move forward on, which I do believe, and I think most developers do too, which is where you see this outrage. But it needs to be faster somehow, right? It's kind of should be, most of the lift on that should be just magical hard work. The platforms of the libraries do. Like, don't say, okay, just kidding. We're going to take this back from you all, and it's time for you to start doing the plumbing you used to do. Or how do you want to subdivide your app between server and client? Like, I don't. I just want to make a product, right? So I think that it's, yes, we need to make some progress on these things, but like most of that progress should be the responsibility of like the lower layers, like the platform and library layers, to figure out how to get back some of that stuff we've lost. So don't go make it the application developer's problem again.
Absolutely. And we've made so much progress on that front if you just objectively look back at the CGI bin days all the way up until now, right? And so, of course, like on the course of day to day or week to week, it can feel, like you're moving forward, or it's like two steps back, but it's not. And the platforms that are going to win are the ones that are going to improve the ergonomics while improving performance. They're offloading what they can from developers, what developers shouldn't be worried with, which is like technical infrastructure, stack, and performance details, assuming that they're building to some reasonable standard and well understood patterns and architecture. That should be sufficient, right? And then it's on the platforms to make sure that that operates quickly. Those are going to be the platforms that win. I don't think React or anybody has an entitlement to the lion's share of the market for developers. When better things come out, developers will use them, period. That's why those platforms will win. And I think if they're focused in the wrong place, yeah, I mean, for a little while, they've got a captive audience, but that's not going to be forever unless they're putting those developers' experience first.
Yep, agree.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you, guys. Do you have any final thoughts on single page applications, multi-page applications, CGI bins, React, Twitter?
Yeah, I just don't remember to leave the blank line when you're writing your CGI between your headers and the body. Like that's my tip, is don't forget that. Otherwise, your browser will just do crazy stuff because it'll think your whole page is the header. That's no good.
Conventions.
Yeah. I guess my final thoughts is none of this matters if you're not dealing with data and interactivity, right? If you want your website to look like a website did in 96, which is fine, by the way, for a lot of applications, then who cares? It doesn't matter. Everything should be server rendered, right? Mm-hmm. But if you want an interactive application, like most folks do, they want it to feel like a program you're running, then you need to optimize for interactivity and managing data. And currently, I think this is a lot easier with single page applications. I think it's a lot easier in most of it when you're generally not server rendering stuff. And I think the platforms, to Jamie's point, the platforms should solve these problems on behalf of the developers. Surprise, surprise, we started a company to do that. But we won't shill right here. But I really do think that optimize for interactivity and optimize for speed of development.
Yeah, absolutely. The Space Jam website from 1996 is still up as it was in 1996, and it's amazing.
If you ever want to look back in time and see what the internet used to look like, just go to any government website. You don't need to fill out a visa form or do your taxes or whatever. Just go there. Yeah. A magical window back in time, and you'll see CGI bin all over the place. You'll see warnings. Do not hit the back button in your browser, or something.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Good old days.
Do not hit
something
back.
Terrible. Like, yeah, all your money will be drained to your bank account if you hit back.
Yeah, it's terrifying. Those warnings. I will leave everybody with this unsolicited advice. I say build your SPAs. I think the tooling and the technology has come such a long way that you can build incredibly performant, high-scale, single-page applications that are still ergonomic. Just look into the trade-offs. Enjoy it. It's more important that you build the thing. Get out there and do it.
Good build.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much.
Tom.
Till next time. Cheers.
See ya.